Hector Medina's office was a stark contradiction, a sanctuary of opulence and life nestled within the decaying industrial heart of the spine. The room was vast, its walls made of reinforced glass that overlooked the fractured skyline of the sprawling city. In his office, however, was a world entirely curated by Hector. Lush greenery flourished in every corner of the office, creating the illusion of a thriving oasis amid the ruin. Towering fiddle-leaf figs and philodendrons climbed trellises, their glossy leaves catching the soft golden light that filtered through hidden fixtures. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and jasmine, a subtle but deliberate attempt to mask the metallic tang of the city's smog. The centerpiece of the room was an enormous living wall, a vertical garden teeming with ferns, mosses, and creeping vines. It stretched from floor to ceiling behind Hector's desk, its irrigation system humming softly, almost imperceptibly. The greenery was interspersed with sculptural light fixtures that cast intricate, dappled shadows across the room, creating the sensation of standing in a forest at dusk. Behind the desk, a luxurious chair upholstered in dark green leather with brass studs added a touch of old-world charm. The chair was perfectly positioned to make Hector appear both commanding and approachable, when he chose to be. Scattered throughout the office were subtle nods to his power and influence. A display case housing rare artifacts, including a ceremonial dagger from a bygone era, and a shard of metal purportedly salvaged from the original spine's construction. Framed photographs of Hector with high-profile clients and powerful figures hung on the walls, juxtaposed with abstract paintings that mirrored the organic chaos of the living greenery. And yet, despite the curated elegance, there was an undercurrent of danger. Subtle security measures were integrated into the design, vents that concealed automated defenses, a concealed weapons locker built into the living wall, and a biometric scanner disguised as a decorative sculpture. The greenery, while lush, hid more than just plants. It was a reminder that even in beauty, Hector's domain was a fortress, built on control and the ruthless exercise of power. The room's silence was broken by a sharp chime, signaling an incoming call. Hector tapped his desk, and a holographic image of his top lieutenant flickered to life. The man's voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of urgency. "It's confirmed, boss. Stroud's shipment will arrive tonight." For a moment Hector said nothing. His expression remained as cold and unreadable as ever, but his knuckles tightened around the glass he was holding. This was a creature of legend, even among those who trafficked in the shadows of the spine. Whistlers were dangerous enough, but the white variant was something else entirely, rarer, more elusive, and rumored to possess properties that could change everything. Its potential value wasn't just in luster, but in what it represented: power, influence, and the ability to manipulate forces no one else understood. "And Stroud?" Hector asked, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "He's delivering it personally, says it's too valuable to trust to anyone else." Hector nodded, dismissing the call with a flick of his wrist. The hologram vanished, leaving the room in a tense silence. Stroud was a wild card, a former corporate enforcer with a vendetta against the powers that be. He was ruthless, cybernetically enhanced, and entirely unpredictable. But Hector wasn't a man easily intimidated. He had waited months for this moment, playing his cards carefully, maneuvering every piece into place. He drained the last of his whiskey and placed the glass on the edge of his desk. Outside, the city groaned under its own weight, a place of endless scheming and betrayal. Hector turned toward the window, his gaze fixed on the spine's jagged skyline. He thought of the White Whistler, a creature that had evaded capture for so long, and what it could mean for his empire. But as the city's lights flickered and dimmed in the distance, Hector felt a rare sensation prickling at the back of his neck: unease. The Whistlers were not mere commodities. They were predators, and tonight he would come face to face with something truly dangerous. The compound's gates groaned open, their rusted mechanisms clashing with the sleek security system scanning the incoming convoy. Hector Medina stood on the balcony overlooking the central courtyard, his expression unreadable. Below, armored vehicles rolled in, their surfaces dull with grime but bristling with weaponry. At the center of the convoy, flanked by heavily armed guards, emerged Straub. Straub was a figure pulled from the deepest recesses of a nightmare. His cybernetic limbs gleamed, sleek in chrome, under the compound's dim industrial lighting, a contrast to the jagged scars crisscrossing his weathered face. Each step he took was accompanied by the faint whir of servos, a chilling reminder of his many encounters with death, and his stubborn refusal to succumb to it. His left arm, entirely mechanical, ended in a claw-like hand, its fingers flexing with precise, almost predatory movements. "Mr. Medina," Straub said, his voice a guttural rasp as he stopped in the center of the courtyard. His gaze swept the compound, his one organic eye narrowing as his cybernetic one glowed faintly. "Quite the fortress you've built here." Hector descended the metal staircase with a deliberate calm, his tailored suit pristine and his movements measured. "Straub," he replied, his voice smooth and cold. "I don't take chances." The two men stood face to face, a tableau of power and menace. Hector, the unflinching kingpin of the spine's underworld, and Straub, a ghost of the corporate wars, each sizing the other up. Straub gestured to his men, who began unloading a reinforced glass pod from the central vehicle. The pod hummed faintly, lined with containment technology that looked both experimental and dangerous. Within it lay the White Whistler. The creature's exoskeleton shimmered like liquid pearl, its surface smooth and flawless. Its pale, segmented limbs twitched intermittently, reflecting the dim light with an unsettling elegance. Bioluminescent veins pulsed faintly beneath its carapace, casting eerie, shifting patterns onto the pod's interior. "I don't think you realize what you've got here," Straub said, his gaze fixed on Hector. "This isn't some run-of-the-mill whistler. This one's different, smarter, deadlier." Hector's eyes flicked to the pod, his expression remaining neutral despite the unease that prickled at the back of his mind. The creature's triangular head tilted slightly, as if aware it was being observed. Its luminous eyes, more vivid and focused than any other whistler he'd seen, seemed to track the room with an intelligence that felt distinctly alien. "I don't need a lecture, Straub," Hector said, his voice sharp. "I know exactly what I'm paying for." Straub smirked, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "That's good. A tool to bring the corporations to their knees. That's why I brought it to you." Hector raised an eyebrow. "And here I thought you were just looking to make a quick profit." Straub's smirk faded. "Profit doesn't matter to me, Medina. I want to see the OLA burn and the corporations sitting at the top of the spine. But as it turns out, so do a lot of people. And those people have money. That thing," he said, nodding toward the pod, "is how we change the balance of power." The pod was wheeled closer, its humming intensifying slightly. Hector studied the creature within, noting the unnatural grace with which it moved, even in its confined space. For a moment, the creature's head snapped toward him, its eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his chest tighten. He brushed off the unease, forcing himself to focus. "It's just another product," Hector said, breaking the silence. "Everything has a price, and I'll get more out of this than you could imagine." Straub's cybernetic fingers tapped against his mechanical forearm, his expression hardening. "I've captured a few whistlers this past year, and this was the hardest by far, and in a location not many are likely to get to either." Hector waved a dismissive hand. "Spare me the warnings. You've been paid, haven't you?" The tension between the two men thickened as the air filled with the low hum of the pod and the faint clicking sounds from within. Finally, Straub extended his metallic hand. Hector hesitated for the briefest moment before gripping it firmly. "Good luck, Medina," Straub said, his voice dripping with something between mockery and pity. "You're going to need it." Straub and his convoy began to leave, their heavy vehicles rumbling out of the compound. The gates groaned shut behind them, sealing Hector and his prize inside. The white whistler remained motionless in its pod, its glowing veins pulsating rhythmically. Hector turned to his lieutenant, who stood nervously nearby. "Get the lab ready," Hector ordered. "I want it processed immediately." The lieutenant nodded, but his unease was palpable. "And what if Stroud's right? What if it's too dangerous?" Hector's eyes hardened. "Everything is dangerous. That's why I'm in charge and you're not." As Hector walked away, the hum of the pod seemed to grow louder, its vibrations almost imperceptibly resonating through the floor. Behind him, the creature's head tilted again, its glowing eyes tracking his movements with silent, chilling precision. The pod was moved to the center of Hector's compound. The creature inside remained unnervingly still, its glowing veins casting faint, flickering light against the darkened walls of the containment chamber. Hector stood in the observation room above, his cold eyes fixed on the pale alien form. This was the dangerous part, but they had prepared for it, layers of plans and contingencies, each one costing him a fortune. A sudden, sharp whine pierced the air as the pod's containment systems cycled down. Red lights flared across the chamber as warning klaxons blared. Hector froze, his eyes narrowing. The white whistler had moved. So quickly it seemed to blur, and now stood poised against the glass, its triangular head tilted as if observing the people outside. "Lock it down!" His men sprang into action, their boots pounding the metal floors as they swarmed the chamber, but it was too late. With a deafening screech, the white whistler's bladed fingers sliced clean through the reinforced pod. Glass and sparks exploded outward as the creature emerged, its bioluminescent glow illuminating the chaotic scene. Its limbs moved with disturbing grace, slicing effortlessly through the first two guards who approached, their bodies crumpled, blood pooling beneath them. The creature emitted a melodic whistle that echoed through the compound. It wasn't just noise, but a declaration. Hector watched, his fists clenched, as the whistler disabled security cameras and cut power to the containment room with perfect premeditation. "What the hell is it doing?" Hector muttered, his voice low but charged with fury. The whistler's movements weren't random. They were deliberate, calculated. It was dismantling the compound's defenses as though it had designed them itself. A security lieutenant stumbled into the observation room, his face pale. "Sir, we've lost control of the lower levels. It's heading toward the main armory." Hector's jaw tightened. "Yes, I can see that. But I want it alive." The chaos below intensified. Guards armed with rifles and shock batons poured into the hallways, their shouts mingling with the eerie, resonant whistle that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. The whistler's sleek, pale form darted through the flickering light, its speed and agility outmatching the men's reactions. It carved through them with brutal precision, leaving a trail of carnage in its wake. From the observation room, Hector watched the live feeds flicker and die one by one. He slammed his fist against the console. "Contain it, now!" The compound had become a war zone. Hector's men moved in teams, their shouts echoing through the steel corridors. Automated turrets swiveled, drones buzzed through the air, and emergency lighting bathed the area in a pulsing red glow. But the white whistler was unstoppable. Hector paced the command room, his mind racing. Every resource he had, every weapon, every tactic was being outmaneuvered. He glanced at the live feed from a drone following the creature. The whistler was perched on a ceiling beam, watching the guards beneath it with chilling focus. When it struck, it was a blur of motion, its limbs slashing through armor and flesh before disappearing into another security blind spot. The compound's lower levels began to flood as a last-ditch effort to trap the creature. Water surged through the hallways, forcing the whistler to higher ground. For a moment, Hector thought they had it contained, until the feed showed it using its limbs to scale a sheer wall, escaping the trap with ease. In the armory, a squad of guards prepared to hold their ground. They were armed with heavy weapons, their faces grim but determined. The whistler appeared at the far end of the hallway, its glowing veins casting an otherworldly light on the wet steel floor. One guard opened fire, his bullets sparking off the walls as the creature darted forward. The Whistler moved like a phantom, closing the distance in seconds. It slashed through the squad, their screams echoing in Hector's ears. Even as reinforcements arrived, the creature adapted, using the environment to its advantage. It even took a grenade from the corpse of a fallen guard, deftly pulled the pin and lobbed it down the hallway, creating a deafening blast that killed several guards and shattered the surveillance drones. No Whistler had ever used human weapons before. Hector watched in growing horror as the Whistler pressed its attack. He had underestimated it. Its intelligence, its strength, its ability to exploit his carefully crafted defenses. Years of control, of calculated power plays, were crumbling before him. "End it now," Hector snarled. "Seal the upper levels, force it into the containment chamber." The compound's remaining forces regrouped, herding the Whistler toward the damaged containment room. Automated turrets roared to life, tracking the creature's every movement. For the first time, the Whistler hesitated. Its head tilted toward the ceiling, its whistle shifting to a high, almost frantic pitch. Hector seized the moment. "Now! Hit it with everything we've got!" The guards battered it with shock batons. Many were killed or injured. The Whistler was finally forced into the containment chamber, its sleek body battered and glowing, blood dripping onto the floor. Hector ordered the chamber sealed, reinforced barriers slamming shut with a deafening clang. The creature lunged, its limbs leaving scratches in the transparent walls. Hector's men hesitated, unsure if the containment would hold, but after several minutes the Whistler stilled, retreating to the center of the chamber. Its whistle grew faint, a haunting melody that lingered in the air. Hector stepped into the blood-soaked corridors, his polished shoes splashing through the crimson pools. His compound was in ruins. Of the dozens of men under his command, fewer than half remained, and most were injured. "Get the labs ready," Hector barked, his voice cutting through the silence. "I want every drop of that thing's blood analyzed. Every fragment it left behind is valuable. I don't care what it costs. Get it done." As his men moved to salvage what they could, Hector paused outside the containment chamber, staring at the pale, still form inside. Despite the destruction, his mind was already calculating the profit this catastrophe could yield. The air in Hector's laboratory was cold and sterile, a sharp contrast to the carnage that had unfolded in the compound hours earlier. Hector stood in the observation room, overlooking a reinforced containment chamber. The walls were thick with alloy plating, the floor sloping slightly to a series of drains. A tangle of tubes snaked along the chamber's ceiling, feeding into a coffin-like containment cell in the center. Inside, the pale form of the White Whistler was bound in manacles, its limbs pinned tightly against its body. Its bioluminescent veins pulsed faintly, casting an eerie glow through the small glass viewport. Surrounding it were half a dozen regular Whistlers, their glossy black forms twitching unnaturally. They moved sluggishly, their sharp movements slower than before. Each creature was connected to the same network of tubes, the ends plunging into their exoskeletons at precise points. The system hummed faintly as a viscous, shimmering liquid was siphoned from their bodies into a collection of reservoirs. Hector observed the scene, his expression unreadable. His compound was in shambles and his men had been decimated, but the sight before him filled him with a dangerous kind of satisfaction. The creatures, subdued and drained, were his now. Their blood, this strange, glowing substance, was no longer a mystery. It was power, distilled and ready to be harnessed. "Sir," a technician called from behind, his voice hesitant. "The first batch is ready. We've refined it as much as we can." Hector turned, his movements deliberate. On the counter behind him sat a small vial filled with the luminous liquid, its faint glow casting strange shadows on the walls. It shimmered in a way that was almost hypnotic, alive with a subtle energy that seemed to hum just beneath the surface. "And you're sure it's stable?" Hector asked, his voice cold. The technician swallowed nervously. As stable as we can make it, given what it is. Hector picked up the vial, holding it to the light. The liquid inside seemed to shift and swirl as though reacting to his touch. His lips curled into a faint smile. "With this," he murmured, "they'll all kneel. The corporations, the scavengers, even the spine itself." He unscrewed the vial, the faintest hiss escaping as the seal broke. The room seemed to grow quieter, the hum of the machines fading into the background as he raised the vial to his lips. For a moment he hesitated, the pale glow of Whistler blood reflected in his dark eyes. Then he drank. The liquid was cold, almost shockingly so, sliding down his throat with an unnatural ease. A wave of heat followed, spreading through his chest and limbs. Hector staggered, gripping the counter as the room seemed to tilt around him. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he heard it, the faint, melodic whistle that had haunted the compound hours earlier. But the dizziness passed, replaced by something else, a rush of clarity, sharper than anything he'd ever experienced. He could feel his heart pounding, every beat echoing in his ears like a drum. His muscles tensed, stronger and more responsive than they'd ever been. His senses expanded, the sterile air of the lab suddenly thick with scents and sounds he'd never noticed before. "This," he whispered, his voice trembling with exhilaration. "This is it." The technician watched in stunned silence as Hector straightened, his posture rigid and his gaze almost predatory. The glow from the Whistler's blood seemed to linger in his eyes, a faint light that sent a shiver down the man's spine. Hector turned back to the containment chamber, his smile widening. The white Whistler tilted its head within the coffin-like restraints, its triangular eyes locking onto his. For the first time, Hector thought he saw something in its gaze, a flicker of understanding, maybe even triumph. But the creature's confidence was misplaced. The victory was his. With this, Hector thought, I'll be king forever. Hector's empire had just entered a new phase, and no one could stop him.